Okay.
Just 1 second, almost. Yes, so we can go ahead, Marta.
Okay, good morning from New York, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. A special welcome to today's guest speaker, Baroness Minouche Shafik. Thank you for being here with us today in what we know is a very busy period of time for you. The title of today's webinar, What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract for a Better Society, is also the title of Professor Shafik's new book, which was released in the US just a couple of weeks ago. Issues related to the social contract have been increasingly brought into policy discussions in recent years, and particularly in recent months. The UN Secretary General himself entitled his Nelson Mandela Lecture on Inequality this past summer, A New Social Contract for a New Era. While there seems to be a growing sense that today's rules and institutions, that the rules and institutions that underpin today's social contract have weakened or may even be obsolete, the how to agree or move towards a new contract is for now less clear. I'm certain that Professor Shafik will help us enormously to flesh out the idea of a new social contract. Before I introduce her, we'll share a short video message from our director, Daniel Abbas, who could not be here with us today. Amin?
For joining us. I would like to warmly welcome all of you and thank Professor Minouche Shafik for joining us in today's webinar, which is part of our series on economic insecurity. In early 2020, our department, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, released the World Social Report 2020. And the theme was inequality in a rapidly changing world. And I'm very proud to say that we have, as Division for Inclusive Social Development that I have the honor to lead, we have drafted it with the most senior and brilliant staff member, Marta Roig, to whom I will then pass the floor once I am done with my very short opening remarks. Well, I have to thank very much Ms. Roig, and of course the chief of the branch where there is the section that drafts the World Social Report, Ms. Wenyang Yang, for their excellent work. Now, I was saying that at the time, the consequences of our deeply unequal world played out in daily headlines. Mass protests fueled by a combination of economic woes, growing inequalities, and the job insecurity. Income disparities, a lack of opportunities, and economic insecurity were creating a vicious cycle of inequality, frustration, and discontent. And then what happens? Well, the COVID-19 crisis. And this crisis has further exposed the precarity of life for so many people. Many of the social groups that fall within the mandates of our division, and I mean older persons, persons with disabilities, young people, indigenous peoples, and the family as a whole, well, were more vulnerable to and disproportionately exposed to the virus and struggled to cope with its lasting economic and social consequences. And there is a growing sense that the rules and institutions that underpin the current social contract are becoming obsolete, that they're failing to provide security and ensure equal rights for all. And in this context, the UN Secretary General has called for a new social contract for a new era to address what he refers to as the inequality pandemic, rampant inequality made even worse by the COVID-19 crisis. And indeed, the COVID-19 crisis has exposed the weaknesses of today's institutions. And at the same time, this pandemic ties our fates together and shows how much our collective actions matter. It can therefore lead to the transformational changes needed to build a new social contract with and between countries. And let's not forget about people. The new social contract has to include also those that in the previous times, in the past, were left behind. And here I'm talking about, for instance, persons with disabilities and indigenous peoples. So it is time to ask ourselves, what should a social contract fit for the 21st century look like? And what role does the state play in promoting the transformational changes necessary to create more secure and equitable societies? Therefore, it is my honor to welcome Baroness Minouche Shafik to this online forum and thank her for sharing her scholarly exploration of what a new social contract fit for today's society should look like. Thank you very much. I will now pass the floor to Ms. Roig, who will moderate today's discussions. Bye.
Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce Baroness Minouche Shafik, whom, as many of you know, is the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Shafik served also as the Vice President of the World Bank, Permanent Secretary of the Department of International Development at the UK, Managing Director of the IMF, and Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. Minouche currently serves as trustee of the British Museum, the Council of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Governor of the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, and is an honorary fellow of St. Anthony's College in Oxford. In 2020 also, the UK government announced that she would be made a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. Professor Shafik, welcome to today's webinar. Professor Shafik will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. Please write your questions in the Q&A or the chat boxes and send them to all panelists during the discussion or at the end of it. Without further ado, and please keep your mics off for the full duration of Professor Shafik's presentation. Without further ado, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's a real pleasure to be here speaking with colleagues at the UN. As was mentioned, my book, which was just published, is called What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract. And the genesis of the book was really my attempt to try and understand the huge divisions in our society, which have been manifested in political polarization, inequality, culture wars, and climate strikes. Polls show that 4 out of 5 people in China, Europe, India, and the United States, as well as many developing countries, feel the system isn't working for them. And the pandemic, of course, compounded this and served as a great revealer, hitting the most vulnerable to the greatest extent and exacerbating inequalities, the old, minorities, women, those in precarious jobs. The book also follows a long intellectual tradition at the London School of Economics of thinking about the relationship between the economy and society, starting with my predecessor, William Beveridge, and his famous report that created the modern welfare state in the UK, to Frederick Hayek, who laid the foundations for the laissez-faire that we associate with the Thatcher and Reagan revolution and the so-called Washington Consensus, as well as the third way, which shaped social democratic thinking of politicians like Clinton, Blair, Schroeder, Lula, and Mbeki. The themes of the book are also highly complementary to the work of the UN and the centrality of the SDGs. I focus in the book on the social contract within countries, but there are, of course, very important parallels in thinking about the social contract between countries, and we can discuss that perhaps later. But let me start by defining what is the social contract. By social contract, I mean the norms and rules that govern how we live together and define what we owe each other. For example, are children raised at home by mothers or grandparents, or does the state provide childcare? How much of healthcare is the responsibility of individuals, and how much do we pay for collectively through insurance or public funding? Do we expect employers to provide contracts with regular hours and benefits such as sick leave and pensions, or do we expect workers and their families to carry the risks of illness and old age? In more traditional societies, what we owe each other tends to be delivered by families and communities. In more modern societies, the market and the state tend to play a greater role. But in all societies, people are expected to contribute to the common good when they're adults in exchange for being looked after when they're young, old, or unable to support themselves. So why do I think the social contract is broken? Well, until the late 20th century, social contracts were built on the premise that families would have a sole male breadwinner and that women would take care of the young and the old. There was a presumption that people would stay married until they died and give birth to children only when married. And they would have steady employment with very few employers over a career, and the education and skills that they accumulated in school would be enough to last a lifetime. And most would have only a few years of life after retirement, and the support that they needed in old age would be provided by families. Now, as I've described that old social contract, you're probably thinking the assumptions that underline those clauses of the old social contracts couldn't be more relevant to modern societies. Today, half of women are employed in the labor market globally, and the upward trend is universal. In advanced economies, between a third and a half of marriages end in divorce. In most developing countries, the rates of divorce are lower, but tend to be increasing. A growing proportion of children are born outside of marriage. The average worker has more jobs over the course of a lifetime, and technology is likely to increase that over time. And while many developing countries are still transitioning to get more workers employed in the formal sector, there are growing signs of informality in labor markets in advanced economies. In many ways, the gig economy is just a fancy name for the informal sector. And climate change brings massive risks that could disrupt our economies and the sustainability of our society. I think the biggest disruptors of the social contract thus far have been the changing role of women and technology. But looking forward, there will be more disruptions caused by aging and climate change. Now, let me start just by clarifying what's the difference between the social contract and the welfare state. The welfare state is just one mechanism for delivering the common goods that are part of the social contract. There's a misconception that the welfare state is primarily about redistributing income from the rich to the poor, the so-called Robin Hood function. But the main purpose of the welfare state is to redistribute income across our own lives, what is sometimes called the piggy bank function. The next slide will illustrate what I mean with data from the UK. What it shows is that most people are paying taxes, the total spending, which is the hump shape, in middle age, and benefiting from transfers of education when they're young and health and social care when they're old in later life. If you look at the UK numbers, for example, most people pay into the state about as much as they take out over the course of their own lives. And that is the role of the state redistributing income across our own life. If you think of it as a clever child, can't go to a bank and say, could I borrow money for my education and I'll pay you back when I earn a higher wage? It doesn't work that way. The state plays the role of financing that education, but expecting that child to pay taxes as an adult in order to enable others in society to benefit. Now, let me give a couple of examples of how I think the current social contract is broken and what I would do to change it to be more relevant to modern societies. Let's start with education. Now, humanity has made huge progress, and the next slide will show you just how much progress in terms of getting children through primary and secondary school. And of course, the SDGs have played a hugely important role in providing a very clear target for getting universal access to education. But huge inequalities persist. And you can see from this chart that most countries are spending most of their resources on primary and secondary education. And of course, that's been much needed. But research from places as different as Jamaica and Chicago show that providing extra nutrition to preschool children and supporting parenting skills results in much better educational outcomes and higher incomes later in life, well before children ever even get to primary school. And hundreds of studies of adult learning have demonstrated how strong links between employers, early intervention, and sustained funding can keep people in work and contributing to society in the face of economic shocks. And so what I would argue is that a better social contract going forward would invest more in the early years before children ever go to school, and when the possibility to equalize opportunity is the greatest, and in adult education, because longer careers and technological changes mean that reskilling throughout life will become essential. Let me turn to employment as another example. One of the most striking things about modern labor markets is that informality, which we used to always associate with developing countries, has become a feature everywhere. More workers are on flexible contract as the labor force has become more diverse, and technology has made it possible for firms to outsource more activities. This flexibility has benefits for employers and consumers, but it has also come at a high cost in terms of security for workers. Workers may have jobs that they might not have otherwise had, but the insecurity about their incomes, hours of work, and what happens when they're sick or old is borne by them. I would argue that a better social contract would retain the benefits of flexibility while providing more workers with security in the form of mandatory benefits for all, regardless of the type of employment contract. Now, the next slide shows you how countries have struck a very different balance. Oh, go back one. The previous slide. Oh, yeah, that's the one. This slide, oh, no, one more forward. No, that's the one, stay there, perfect. This shows you how different countries have made the choice between flexibility of their labor market and security for workers. And you can see that many countries have chosen different mixes. For me, the sweet spot is the upper right-hand corner, where you find countries like New Zealand and Denmark and Australia and Jamaica, for example, where you have high levels of flexibility, so employers can change workers in response to changes in the economy, but at the same time, those workers benefit from a fair degree of security and confidence that if they lose their job, they'll get unemployment insurance and support to retrain to be placed in a new job very quickly. Finally, let me say something about the social contract between the generations. Now, every generation wants to leave the next one better off. But I think we are at risk of leaving future generations with very poor prospects for their livelihoods, a legacy of debt, and a severely damaged planet. If you look at the next slide, we see that for the first time in all the advanced economies, parents fear that their children will be worse off than they are. It's not true in the developing world, where parents still have confidence that their children will be better off than they are. The pandemic, of course, has disrupted the education of millions of children around the world and also resulted in the accumulation of debts at levels never seen before in human history. And there is no doubt that this generation will inherit a planet that is both hotter and has less biodiversity. So how can we put the intergenerational social contract right? I would argue that we need to invest in the education of young people to enable them to be productive over what will be very long working lives. The resulting gains in productivity would help pay for the elderly care needs of an aging population and make debt more sustainable in the future. I think we should give young people an educational endowment for life so that they can adapt to changes in work and give everyone better access to reskilling opportunities. We also need to clearly act on redressing some of the environmental damage that we've done. And to achieve and to pay for that, older people will probably have to work longer. And I argue we should link retirement ages explicitly to life expectancy so that people will adjust their expectations and continue to contribute in the form of taxation over longer careers. So let me try and pull this together and just highlight what I think are the three principles that guide us in thinking about what a new social contract would look like. And the three principles I use in the book are minimum security for all, better sharing of risks, and maximum investment in capability. And I'll say something briefly about each. On minimum security for all, I think in every society, it is possible to put a floor on people's incomes below which no one should go. This can be achieved through cash transfer programs in developing countries, which are incredibly effective and increasingly widespread, or in high-income countries, tax credits for low-wage workers. That minimum should also include access to basic healthcare and a minimum state pension to avoid destitution in old age. It should also include sick leave and unemployment insurance, regardless of the type of employment contract. And in developing countries, that means bringing many more workers into the formal sector. And in advanced economies, it means mandating that employers pay benefits to flexible workers. Let me turn to sharing risks better. I would argue that too many risks in our society are borne by individuals when they could be more efficiently borne by others or managed collectively. For example, it's possible to maintain flexibility for employers being able to hire and fire workers depending on market conditions if those workers know that they'll get unemployment insurance and retraining to provide them with the security until they find a new job. A similar rebalancing of risk needs to occur around childcare and health and old age. For example, it's not clear why the costs of maternity leave are usually borne by employers, when parental leave paid for through general taxation would create a more level playing field for men and women in the labor market and be less of a burden to firms, especially small ones. Similarly, many health risks are much better managed when pooled over a large population rather than borne by individuals. Automatic enrollment in pension schemes and in insurance for old age care will give individuals more security at the end of their lives. And requiring people to have social care insurance, like countries like Japan and Germany do, is a good way to pool risks around old age. On the third principle, let me turn to the principle of maximum investment in opportunity and capability. In too many places, talent is wasted because opportunities are not provided to all, and disaffection is greatest where the prospects that you can improve your lot over time are low or falling. The next slide will show you one of the most striking figures in the book, which is the number of generations it takes to go from the bottom of the income distributions to the middle in different countries. In the UK and the US, it takes 5 generations. In Denmark, it takes 2. In South Africa or Brazil, it takes 9 generations to go from the bottom of the income distribution to the middle. That is almost no social mobility at all. And much of that wasted talent is embedded in women, minority groups, and children who happen to be born to families or in places that are unable to give them opportunities. For example, in the US, you can explain between 20 and 40% of the productivity gains that were made between 1960 and 2010 simply by the fact that rather than draw on a narrow talent pool of white men, changes in laws and norms in the social contract meant that employers were able to choose from a broader pool of skills and allocate jobs to those that suited them best. Similarly, if today's lost Einsteins, women, minorities, children from low-income families, were able to invent to the same degree as white men from high-income families, the rate of innovation could quadruple. So how can we better use the talent in our societies? In addition to investing in the early years, we could also give all young people an equal entitlement to education, perhaps with a lifetime endowment to pay for university or vocational training over longer careers. While most countries have equalized educational opportunities for boys and girls, women are still hugely disadvantaged, and we know do about 2 hours more unpaid work than men. More generous parental leave, public funding to support families, and a fairer division of labor at home would mean that female talent is better used in our societies. Now, I know we will talk about the politics of implementation, and I'm happy to do that. I would argue that there are some patterns as to which kind of politics tends to deliver better social contracts. Countries that have more inclusive political systems, where there's strong accountability mechanisms like free and fair elections, free media, tend to have better social contracts. Countries that have proportional representation, rather than presidential winner-takes-all systems, are also more prone to have more equal social contracts. And authoritarian regimes who face little accountability have few pressures to deliver on a better social contract. I do think that the pandemic will change politics in many countries. A survey that I saw recently in 24 countries before and after the pandemic found that people have become more afraid, hostile, and let down by society. At the same time, less human contact has made people feel that they value social solidarity more, equality, community, and freedom. And similarly, a survey by the IMF in the US found that those who'd experienced serious illness or job loss caused by the pandemic or who know someone who has experienced that, favor a temporary progressive levy or a progressive tax reform to a greater extent than those who didn't experience those costs from the pandemic. Finally, just to close, a new social contract is not about higher taxes, more redistribution, and a bigger welfare state. It's actually about a fundamental reordering and equalizing of the distribution of opportunities and security in our societies. The result of this would be higher productivity and the possibility to more efficiently share the risks around childcare, health, work, and old age that are the source of so much anxiety in modern societies. Financing such a reordering requires rebalancing the relative taxation of capital, which is taxed too little, relative to labor, which tends to be taxed too much. Introducing taxes on things we want less of, like carbon and smoking, and investing more in education and greening the economy. We owe each other more than our current social contracts can deliver, and a bit less emphasis on me and a bit more emphasis on we would benefit enormously. A new social contract is possible, where everyone is guaranteed a minimum for a decent life, where we share risks more humanely, and where we draw on everyone's talents. And I think the three principles that I've laid out provide a basis for thinking about what that new social contract would look like. And what we could do if we adopted those is create the foundation for a society where we recognize our interdependence, enable everyone to fulfill their potential, and ask everyone to contribute as much as they can for the common good. Stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Shafik, for this thought-provoking and at the same time encouraging, uplifting presentation. We have a couple of questions. I'd like to use also my role as moderator to ask one, but maybe I'll move first to the questions that we have already on the Q&A, and then should we take a couple of questions or three?
Sure.
Okay. So first, okay, here is one. Could you please tell us how you build the protection flexibility classification, on the basis of which indicators? That's one. And a related one is on the sweet spot with respect to protection and flexibility. Why do you consider it so desirable? And what is wrong, in your opinion, with countries that provide high levels of protection but not so much flexibility? So these two questions are obviously related.
Yeah, absolutely.
While we wait for additional questions to come in, can I ask my own? So you said yourself that the welfare state is obviously just one mechanism for a strong social contract to function. The social contract is a much broader concept than that, but it's an important one. And my question is, in the past, a strong working class, the working class was a strong lobby for a strong welfare state, not necessarily a big welfare state, but a strong welfare state. This working class doesn't exist anymore. So how is change going to happen? The pandemic may trigger changes, but is the pandemic enough? Who's going to push for these changes now that part of the working class has been disenfranchised and in fact votes for fringe parties that do not necessarily support either the welfare state or a new and strong social contract? So that's my question. Now we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll let you answer this and then we move on.
So great questions. On the question around flexibility and security, if you have a look at the book, it's figure 10. The definition it's an index that was developed at the World Bank. It includes flexibility is defined as the rigidity of hours, restrictions on hiring, financial costs of dismissal, and protection is defined as public spending on health, education, income support, and employment services. So it's an index of all of those things. But if you have a look at the book, it's explained in much more detail. The reason I think that top quartile is the right place to be is because flexibility means your economy is able to adjust to shocks and to adapt. And I think many developing countries have actually, if you think of countries like the US is a country where you have high flexibility, very low security, and you get the kind of labor market outcomes that you have in the US. In Europe, you tend to have low flexibility, high security. That ends up resulting in a great deal of rigidity in the market and a lack of competitiveness. Many developing countries actually have the worst of all worlds, which is they have the informal sector with high flexibility and no security. That's where most people are. And the formal sector, which is a very small minority, have low flexibility and lots of protection. And in many ways, that's the worst possible combination, because your higher income workers are the most protected and the poor are the least protected. So I actually think that the top quadrant is a great place to be. If you look at the Nordic countries, they have very high labor turnover. People lose their job all the time, but there's very little social anxiety about it, because people have unemployment insurance that maintains their standard of living, and they very quickly find new work. And it keeps the economy dynamic, but at the same time, it provides people with some security and a feeling that society is supporting you to adjust through change, as opposed to abandoning you. On your question, Marta, about the working class and who is going to push for these changes, you're quite right that the nature of social pressures for these kind of changes has changed. Unionization has fallen dramatically. It's about halved in recent years, if you look at the last 20 or 30 years, in terms of the proportion of the labor force that is in a union and is using union pressure for change. I think there are a lot of interesting new forms of social organization, often digitally enabled, that are pressing for change. So you probably didn't follow it, but recently in the UK, for example, Uber drivers organized and took the company to court, and the Supreme Court ruled that they are employees and that they deserve sick leave and pension entitlements. Sewa in India is an example of a social movement that has organized self-employed women to organize for their rights for decades now, quite effectively. And so I think we need to be looking at those kinds of social movements that will press governments to do more to reform the social contract.
Thanks so much for this. We have many more questions, so I'm going to take the 3 next ones. It's okay. You have many congratulations for your presentation. So this question is about between theory and implementation. I think you partly answered this. How do we overcome the barriers, components of political will, economic, political, even imagination barriers, in order to convince the world that this must be done? Once there's a will, we will find a way. How do we build the will? There's another one. We live in a world where migration is on the rise, and the security needs, rights, and skills of, sorry, I can see one. Give me 1 second, I can see. The skills of migrants are often contested. I'm sorry. How does the new social contract that you propose cope with the issues around human mobility? Yeah. And the third one is how do we address the growth of the modern financial markets and the use of technology within the new social contract? Small questions.
Huge questions. We could spend an hour on each. So I won't do them justice. I'm really sorry, but I'll do my best. So on political will, when you look historically at when there have been big changes to the social contract, it's often on the back of a crisis. So the New Deal in the US came after the Great Depression. In the UK, the Beveridge Report came on the back of World War II. I would argue that the combination of the 2008 financial crisis and the failure to deal with the fundamental issues it raised, compounded by the pandemic, means we are at such a moment. I think you look around the world at politics in different countries, and there is so much frustration and anger in countries that are very different than each other. And so I think what we're seeing here is a very fundamental moment of change. And so I guess, I partly wrote this book. I sometimes call it my anti-populist manifesto. because, you know, I think the rise of populist politics in many countries reflects the fact that populists have identified the right problems. People are frustrated with inequality. They feel the system is rigged. They feel frightened about their own futures and that of their children. So the diagnosis is correct, but the answers that they propose are wrong. Xenophobia, nationalism, protectionism, those are not going to solve these problems. And what I've tried to do in the book is lay out a set of reforms that I think could solve those very legitimate worries about insecurity and lack of opportunity. What I hope and what I know from my experience as a policymaker is that political pressure builds up. There's a sense that something must be done. And whatever ideas are lying around at that moment, that's what they do. And so I'm hoping that some of the ideas in this book are the ones that people grab when they feel the pressure that something must be done. Question on migration. So yeah, migration is a huge issue, and we know from the research that migrants are often the most dynamic and productive bits of the economy, and often bring huge benefits. But of course, the social and political consequences are very complex these days, and we see a backlash against migration in many, many countries. You know, I think when you unpick the backlash, what it's really about is, when does someone from the outside get to join the social contract in my country? When do they get benefits? How much do I invest in their children as opposed to my children? When are they part of the contract? And I think thinking about it as in that way helps a society figure out how much migration do they want and how will they cope with migrants. And I'm thinking here more of economic migrants rather than refugees, because I think that's a different set of issues. But countries that actively take migrants need to think those issues through in order to have a sensible migration policy. And I think if they think about it that way, it'll be a slightly more productive discussion than what we often hear now, which is tinged with xenophobia, fear of difference, et cetera, et cetera. And then technology and finance. Well, I mean, technology is transforming financial markets enormously and increasing opportunities for access in so many ways. I think many of the aspects of the social contract that I've talked about have been enabled by technology. Think about cash transfer payments, which have now exist in more than 100 developing countries, enabled by mobile payment systems and mobile banking. That's just one example. Increasingly now, actually, many countries are developing what they call shock-sensitive social protection. So if a drought hits a particular part of the country or the pandemic affects a particular community, you're able to adjust cash transfer payments to those communities immediately in response to that. So I think finance and technology are creating a whole new set of tools that will enable us to deliver a better social contract.
Thanks so much, Professor. There's a few questions that are somehow related, so I'm going to ask them together. One is for developing countries with limited fiscal space. What do you suggest is the highest priority in terms of building a stronger or a new social contract of sorts? Well, I mean, obviously there are differences across countries, but if you can give some general clues. And the other one is, OECD countries, do you think that a new social contract would require devoting a greater percentage of GDP to public spending? Or what we need is just a rebalancing? Would that be enough? And would there be a risk of intergenerational conflict if you rebalance spending from, say, pensions to early childhood development, or the other way around, depending on how? Let's focus maybe on these two questions.
On fiscal issues. So on fiscal space, if I had to identify the highest priority, I would probably say early years education, because I think the payoff to that is just so high. And if you don't support children in those early years, no matter how good a school you send them to, no matter how good a worker retraining program you develop, all of that will be wasted unless the foundations are strong. And so for me, that is, I think, probably a very, very high priority. In terms of whether this is necessarily increasing public spending, in the book, in the final chapter, I kind of talk through the fiscal aspects. There are many of these things that I've described are investments, and so they need to be financed, but they will generate very high returns. We know globally, based on data from over 1,000 years across 100 countries, that the rate of return on education is about 10%. That's a very high return investment, and that will pay itself back. Some things like the minimum healthcare requirements and pensions for the elderly who are poor will cost more public spending. And those will have to be accommodated. And in the book, I talk about how you can finance them, including things like a carbon tax and doing a better job on corporate taxation. And I think the OECD proposals, for example, which are being discussed at the moment, are a really good solution to the corporate tax issue. I think for most developing countries, there is room to raise more revenue. If you look at the taxation systems in most developing countries, the tax rates are very similar to advanced economies, but they collect about half as much revenue because of the informal sector and because of poor tax administration. So you don't necessarily have to raise tax rates in the developing world. You just need to improve the efficiency of tax collection. And I think that will be key. In many advanced economies, the story is a little bit different, and they will have to reallocate from within spending. And then on intergenerational issues, I think there is an intergenerational deal that can be done. And I think it involves persuading the older generation who have, in many electoral systems, disproportionate power because young people don't tend to vote as much. Persuading the older generation that they will have to work longer, retire a bit later, invest more in this younger generation. And in exchange, we all have an interest in this younger generation being highly productive because they're the ones who are going to pay for our healthcare and pensions in most countries. And so I think talking about this as an intergenerational compromise is quite powerful. And I think getting people to care not just about their own children, but other people's children and other people's grandchildren, and realizing that we have a collective interest in having a younger generation that is highly skilled is a way to reconcile the intergenerational issues.
Great, and this links very well to a question that I had missed, which is, assuming that there's here it says an 18-year gap in healthy life expectancy between social groups. I mean, that depends on which country, but obviously there is a gap in health expectancy. How will linking retirement age to life expectancy work in the context of these inequalities? And if you establish the same working age for everyone, isn't this a regressive measure then? And with flexibility valued, how do people accumulate decent pensions? That's just from the same person.
Sorry, the last question was?
With flexibility valued, meaning with
oh yes,
flexibility in the labor market, how do people accumulate decent pensions?
Understood. Okay, so on the life expectancy link and the gap in life expectancy, obviously that varies in countries, but it is certainly true in all countries. Poor people live less long than rich people. That is a universal truth. And when you look at the causes of that, it is often not to do with the quality of healthcare they have access to. In many countries, take the UK, there's a national health service. Everybody has access to the same healthcare, but rich people still live much longer than old people. And the reason, the poor people, the reason is, of course, because of their social conditions, environmental impacts, diet, kinds of jobs they do, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the book, I argue that obviously providing a minimum standard of healthcare to all is a precondition for a good social contract. But actually, as important are other elements of the social contract: security around work, decent benefits, et cetera, et cetera. And so the wider social contract, I think, is the way to close that life expectancy gap between the rich and the poor. It isn't just about access to healthcare, it's both. And I think the other thing I'd say is that the argument has often been made that some jobs you have lower life expectancy, so you should retire earlier. That gap is closing over time. And, the argument that you can't work longer because you're unhealthy later in life. Actually, what the research is showing is that people are living longer and that unhealthiness just gets pushed out in time. And so that the ability of people to actually have longer careers is possible in many countries. I think, obviously life expectancy varies enormously across countries. But at the moment, if you look across, if you look at the data in the advanced economies, people now expect to spend about 1/3 of their adult life in retirement. That's unprecedented. And the amount of years that we work relative to the amount of years in retirement has just gotten out of balance. And obviously for every country, what that balance is will vary. But in most countries that have formal pension systems, it is out of balance. And we need to try and restore the balance between the years in which you work and then the years in which you are not working and are supported by a pension. The question on how do you get a decent pension when you have flexible workers, it's a challenge, because if people get benefits in proportion to how many hours they work and they only work, let's say 10 or 20 hours a week, the size of the pension they will accumulate will be limited. I guess what I would start by saying is starting to get some pension is better than no pension, which is the current situation for many flexible workers in many countries. So that's step one. The other thing I'd say is that there does need to be a minimum state pension to prevent destitution in old age. So there should be a minimum floor which prevents people from being very poor in old age. And I think the combination of that with accumulated pensions associated with work would be the solution to the problem.
Thanks very much. If it's okay with you, I'll ask one last set of questions, and I'd like to end with one that I think is very important for us at least, and that I hope you can devote some time to. Let me first start with the other two which are related to. Do you have encouraging examples of engaging the private sector in renegotiating the social contract, especially in light of the weakening of trade unions and worker rights movements?
Yeah.
And related to that, where does the power and resources of global companies fit in all this? These companies avoid paying taxes or pay very little, etc., etc. But so these are two questions that are somehow related. And the last one is the social contract and its renegotiation is ultimately a domestic issue. At the same time, what should international institutions such as the UN do to contribute to a new, more inclusive social contract?
Yeah, okay, great. Perfect question to end on. So on the role of the private sector, I do talk about this in the book, and I think, in many ways, it's really heartening to see many private sector leaders talking about the purpose of business, environmental, social, and governance reforms. And that is a very good thing. And I think there's some really thoughtful and leadership going on among many chief executives and business leaders in many countries in the world. I think for me, I think business needs to do three things in the social contract. First and foremost, they should pay their taxes. And that means doing, I think the OECD's proposals, you have a minimum global corporate tax. And I think it means also paying tax in the community in which you operate. And so I think the tax optimization and moving around profits and around to take advantage of tax havens, I think those loopholes need to be closed. It is really striking when you look at the numbers, how little many corporations are taxed in countries where they operate. And that is not fair to the communities in which they operate, where they earn those profits. It's also not fair to national companies who can't take advantage of these international tax optimization strategies and locate all their profits in low tax jurisdictions. So I think we need to sort out global corporate taxation. Second, I think that the move around voluntary approaches to environmental, social, and governance improvements is a very good thing. And that consumers and investors who are putting pressure on companies to do better on environmental standards, on treatment of their workers, on corporate governance issues. I think that is fantastic and should be encouraged. But I would also say, the third thing I'd say is that this movement that that's called ESG is really only powerful for listed companies with brand names. And the pressure of consumers and investors is really only affecting them. The vast majority of companies in the world operate below the radar screen. They're not listed on public stock exchanges. They don't necessarily have brand names that people recognize and that consumers would act on. So in the end, I do think that you need regulatory and legal changes that define what those environmental and social standards are, which is why I would argue we need to mandate benefits to all flexible workers, which is why I would argue you need a carbon tax so that companies pay carbon taxation and have a strong incentive to improve their environmental performance. So those are the three things I would ask of the private sector. Marta, should I turn to your last question now? Okay, so what is the social contract only domestic, and what should international organizations do? So some people have asked me, Minouche, you've spent more than 25 years of your career working in international organizations. Why have you written a book about domestic policy? And it's a good question. And the answer is that, I realized that the backlash against globalization and internationalism is rooted in the fact that many people feel they have not benefited from it. And until we have domestic social contracts that make sure that the benefits of a globalized, interdependent, international, open world, rules-based world, generates domestic benefits, we will not have support for the international system. And so, I'm now increasingly of the view, I think it's no accident that countries that have the most open economies tend to have the largest welfare states. Why is that? Because if you're a very open economy, you're subject to external shocks, and you need the welfare state to cushion those shocks for your citizens. So I think we need better social contracts as a prelude to reigniting people's commitment to an international rules-based system. And I think the role of international organizations is to help countries develop national level social contracts that deliver for their citizens and ultimately build support for an international social contract that recognizes that not only do we owe each other more within countries, but we also owe each other more globally. And we owe each other more globally, particularly to deal with global public goods like pandemics, like climate change, and like spillovers of international conflicts. And so I see the two very interlinked and very complementary.
Thank you so much. This is such a perfect ending that I hesitate to add anything to it. Because, this word should echo strong national social contracts are a precondition for trust in international cooperation, indeed. And there's something else you have said before. Historically, crises have triggered major policy changes. It looks like as humans, we have to touch bottom before we lift up. And that governments or institutions will pick up on the ideas that are out there at the moment, and many of these ideas are highlighted in your book. And I hope that we will do our best for your ideas and your book to reach those in decision-making positions. And I hope we can continue talking to you.
Thank you very much, Marta. And if, please do spread the word and spread the ideas and encourage people to adopt them. That's exactly why I wrote the book.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.